Number 1.
Not all murder cases I have worked on involve celebrities, most are everyday Americans. However, like O.J. Simpson, there are cases where celebrities are involved. Another one of these is the Robert Blake murder trial. Unlike Simpson, Blake wasn't the victim, but the accused. The following excerpt from my book, Blood Secrets, details the case details and my involvement. It was May 4, 2001 when Blake and his wife, Bonny Bakley, went to dinner at one of their longtime favorite restaurants in Studio City, California. Blake normally used the restaurant's valet service, but on this night he parked his car down the street behind a construction dumpster under a burned-out street lamp. The couple had dinner that night and walked back to their car when Blake claims to have suddenly realized he left a gun he carries for their protection in the restaurant booth. He left Bonny at the car and returned to the restaurant. Blake claims that when he returned to the car after retrieving the gun, he found his wife, Bonny, slumped in the passenger seat, bleeding copiously from 2 gunshot wounds, one to her right cheek and one to her shoulder. Blake ran to nearby residences and found Sean Stanek, a filmmaker, and asked him to call 911, then returned to the restaurant for more help. Bonny Bakley died in the car a short time later. She was 44 years old. There were a number of concerning details in the Blake case. First, Blake claims to have carried a gun because he was worried someone was stalking his wife. However, he parked his car on a dark street, far from the restaurant. Also, nobody remembers Blake returning to the restaurant to retrieve a gun, and the table had already been bussed, and nobody reported finding a gun. Blake also left his wife behind at the car without the keys, so she had no way to roll up the windows or turn on the heater, despite the cold evening and her lightweight nylon outfit. Patrons of the restaurant remember Blake coming in distraught and shouting that his wife had been shot, then drinking 2 glasses of water before returning to the scene of the shooting. These details were all troubling to police and, on April 18, 2002, the actor was arrested for the murder of his wife. After police questioned the couple's bodyguard, Earl Caldwell, and unearthed the murder weapon, a World War I-era handgun, Caldwell was also arrested for conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutor Shelley Samuels called my office and asked me to examine the evidence in the Blake case. She and 2 colleagues flew to Portland with Blake's clothing, and I examined them using my normal protocol. I put on gloves, laid the first item of clothing out on butcher paper, and photographed every inch of it. Then tested the clothing for traces of blood using luminol. Once completed, I resealed the item, throw the butcher paper away, put on new gloves, and start the process again on the next item of clothing. This process eliminates the possibility of cross-contamination. Blake's clothing showed no traces of blood. However, no matter who the killer was, they probably wouldn't have gotten bloody throwback on their clothing. I knew this because I flew to Los Angeles and examined Blake's car. The measurements showed when Bakley was shot, the blowback traveled only about 8.5 inches. High-velocity mist is very fine and light, so it never flies farther than 4 feet from the point of entry of the bullet. Next, we traced the trajectory of each bullet working backwards from the point of entry. To understand the path of entry, imagine steel rods running from each exit wound back toward the entry wound. This determines trajectory. This path, as well as Bakley's body position, told us whoever shot her fired through the open car window. That meant she saw her killer pointing a gun at her, and she leaned to her left toward the driver's side in a classic defensive position. In my opinion, she was first shot in the head and secondly in the shoulder. To help jurors understand all aspects of a case, sometimes it is necessary to film recreations of the event. In this case, I filmed an actress sitting in a car while reenacting Bakley's movements. We also work with animation experts to create computerized video reconstructions of crimes, which we play at trial. Blake's trial proved to be a goldmine for tabloids due to his celebrity status. Blake also granted several jailhouse interviews to famous reporters. This, along with former stuntmen from Blake's old movie days, a minister, and a private investigator, all stepping forward to claim Blake had offered the money to kill his wife, set jury selection back to square one. The tensest moment came for me, not during testifying, but after when the trial broke for lunch. I pushed a button for the elevator on the 8th floor and stepped onto the empty elevator as someone thrust an arm between the closing doors. When the doors opened, there stood Robert Blake. We gazed at each other for a second, then he stepped in, the doors closing behind him. Both of us stood there in stone-faced silence, staring intently at the ceiling, the elevator buttons, the floor, anywhere but at each other. It was the longest elevator ride of my life. On March 16, 2005, Blake was finally acquitted of murdering his wife, though the jury remained deadlocked 11-1 on the solicitation of murder count until the judge dismissed the charge. Blake's longtime bodyguard, Earl Caldwell, was also acquitted. The following year, Bakley's relatives brought a wrongful death suit against the actor. I was asked to provide evidence as to how the crime unfolded based on blood spatter and bullet wounds. Blake lost the case and was ordered to pay his late wife's relatives $30 million. He declared bankruptcy less than 3 months later.
Number 2.
During the early months of 1901, 27 burglaries were committed in Pittsburgh, and the modus operandi of these bold thieves convinced the authorities that the crimes were all committed by the same persons. In the early morning of April 12, an effort was made to burglarize the grocery store conducted by Thomas Connie, who discovered them in the act and was shot dead by one of the thieves. On the same morning, Inspector of Police Robert Gray and Detective Patrick Fitzgerald received information that the movements of a gang of men and women living at 34 Fulton Street should be investigated. The officers proceeded to the house, and upon being refused admission they began to force an entry. As they did so, a shot was fired which killed Fitzgerald. A posse then surrounded the house, and 2 brothers, named Ed and Jack Biddle, Frank Dorman, and 2 women, known as Jenny Wilcox and Jessie Wright, were arrested. It was then learned that the men of this gang committed many and probably all of the 27 burglaries above referred to, and also the murder of Connie, the grocer. The entire gang was charged with murder, the 2 brothers being convicted and sentenced to be hanged on December 12, 1901. Dorman was sentenced to life imprisonment, and the 2 women were acquitted. The governor granted the Biddle brothers a respite of 60 days, during which time they were confined in the Allegheny County Jail in Pittsburgh. At 4 a.m. January 30, 1902, Ed Biddle called from his cell to guard James McGeary and announced that his brother had been taken suddenly ill and requested that the guard procure some cramp medicine immediately. McGeary hastened to comply with the request, and when he returned with the medicine, the Biddles broke through the bars which they had sawed almost in 2. They then grappled with McGeary and threw him over a railing down to a cement floor 16 feet below. The guard struck on his head, and for some time it was believed he would die. The desperate men then produced revolvers which had been smuggled into them, and they shot another guard named Reynolds, inflicting a serious but not fatal wound. As only one other guard was present, they covered him with a revolver and threw him into the dungeon where his outcries could not be heard. As these 2 men then became complete masters of the prison, they took the keys from McGeary's person and walked out of the prison into Ross Street. When Warden Peter Soffel was informed of what had transpired, he almost collapsed, but when he recovered himself, he stated that his wife, the mother of his 4 children, had disappeared and that circumstances convinced him that her infatuation for Ed Biddle, who was a handsome fellow, caused her to surreptitiously supply the brothers with the saws and weapons, and that she had probably accompanied them in their flight. At this time the ground was completely covered with snow, and a posse, consisting of 3 Pittsburgh detectives and 5 other officers, started in pursuit in sleighs. On the next day, January 31, the officers learned that the Biddle brothers and Mrs. Soffel had dinner at J.J. Stevens' home at Mount Chestnut, 5 miles east of Butler, Pa. The officers started in pursuit, and upon nearing M.C. Kluwer's barn, 2 miles from Mount Prospect, they saw the 2 brothers and Mrs. Soffel attempting to escape in a sleigh. When the officers got within 60 yards of the trio, they commanded them to halt, but as the order was ignored, the officers opened fire with their rifles. The brothers responded, and during the fusillade they received fatal wounds and rolled off the sleigh onto the snow. Mrs. Soffel was also wounded in the breast and fell onto the snow, but by a miracle none of the officers was injured.
Number 3.
If you were staying at the World's Fair Hotel, more commonly known as the H. Holmes House or Murder Mansion, you might run up a flight of stairs and find that it led to nowhere. You'd open doors and see only solid brick. You'd enter a bedroom, hear hidden pipes quietly come alive, and smell the gas seeping in. You'd try to run and realize you were locked in. And even if the door opened, you probably couldn't find your way out. Only H. Holmes himself ever knew all of the castle's secrets, including how many people died within its walls. One of history's most infamous serial killers, H. Holmes came to Chicago in 1886, leaving behind more than one previous life. Born Herman Webster Mudgett, previous scandals gave him good reason to change his name. Like in college, when he worked in the anatomy lab and mutilated cadavers to defraud life insurance companies. Or when he was the last person to have been seen with a missing little boy in New York. Or when he worked as a pharmacist in Philadelphia and a young customer died after taking pills that he had provided. Mudgett skipped town after all of these incidents and eventually became Henry Howard Holmes, who soon after his arrival in the Windy City got a job in a drugstore on 63rd Street, using his knowledge of medicine and his ability to charm everyone he met to secure his position. Holmes was fashionable, bright, and likable. In fact, he was so charming that at one point in his life, he was married to 3 unknowing women at once. In 1887, he bought the empty lot across the street from the store where he worked and began construction on a 3-story building, which he said would be used for apartments and shops. The structure was ugly and large, containing more than 100 rooms and stretching for an entire block. Chicago was a city on the rise in the late 1880s, and new construction was going up all over this stretch of the American Midwest. The city was perfectly situated on the shore of Lake Michigan, and it was the central hub for the expansive railroad networks that crisscrossed the nation, all extending like spokes in a wheel from the city of Chicago. For his mansion, H. Holmes planned for the first floor to contain an entire block of storefronts he would be able to rent out to the flood of new businesses opening up in the city. The third floor would contain apartments for the growing population of the city, looking to make it big in the Windy City, some of whom would become Holmes' victims. Those victims got to see the second floor, and the especially unlucky ones made it into the basement, which hid the elaborate horrors for which the H. Holmes house is now famous. Holmes switched builders and architects frequently throughout the building's construction, so no one involved was able to realize the gruesome end goal of all the odd parts. The castle was completed in 1892, and by 1894, police would be exploring its winding passages while Holmes sat behind bars. At first, they were confused at what they found. There were hinged walls and false partitions. Some rooms had 5 doors and others had none. Secret, airless chambers hid underneath floorboards, and iron plate-lined walls stifled all sound. Holmes' own apartment had a trapdoor in the bathroom, which opened to reveal a staircase, which led to a windowless cubicle. In the cubicle, there was a large chute that tunneled through to the basement. Spoiler: it wasn't used for dirty laundry. One notable room was lined with gas fixtures. Here, Holmes would seal his victims in, flip a switch in an adjacent room, and wait. Another chute was nearby. All of the doors and some of the steps were connected to an intricate alarm system. Whenever someone stepped into the hall or headed downstairs, a buzzer sounded in Holmes' bedroom. The first clue about the bizarre floor plan's true purpose came to the cops in a pile of bones. Most of them were animals, but some of them were human, so small they had to have belonged to a child, no more than 6 or 7 years old. When they descended into the cellar, the scope of the building's hidden horrors was revealed. Beside a blood-covered operating table, they found a woman's blood-soaked clothes. Another surgical surface was nearby, along with a crematory, an array of medical tools, a bizarre torture device, and shelves of disintegrating acids. Holmes' fascination with dead bodies had lasted long past college, as had his surgical skills. After dropping his victims down through the chutes, he would dissect them, clean them, and sell the organs or skeletons to medical institutions or on the black market. Though the mansion didn't look inviting in the least, it's unlikely that any of the victims were dragged into its depths. They entered on their own volition, likely enchanted by the owner's flattery and apparent affluence. Often they were his employees. During his 2 short years in the castle, Holmes hired more than 150 women to work as his stenographers. A few of those were known to be his mistresses as well. Most of them came from wealthy families, and some of them never saw those families again. Holmes sometimes photographed his favorites. They were young, beautiful, and trusting of this gentleman in the big and unfamiliar city. As a city on the rise and centrally located nationally thanks to its railway hub, there was a fresh flow of people coming in and out of Holmes' murder mansion. Despite the well-connected women who went missing under his employment, suspicions of murder weren't what eventually led to Holmes' demise. People come and go all the time in a big city, often without notice, so the disappearance of the young women working under Holmes could always be excused as young women moving on or heading back home. Rather, theft and financial schemes gone wrong caused his arrest in Boston on November 17, 1894. After decades of criminal activity, the scale and complexity of which you really need a book to fully grasp, H. Holmes was behind bars. While in jail, connections between him and at least one murder were revealed, and a pile of financial charges were obscured by the more sinister accusations. Though he boasted of committing at least 27 murders, he gave 3 different confessions while imprisoned, all with contradicting numbers. The true amount of victims was impossible to corroborate because the mansion was specially equipped for Holmes to disintegrate leftover body parts in acid baths or to burn them in a human-sized stove. In one pile of ashes, investigators found a small gold chain from a woman's shoe. "I was born with the devil in me," Holmes would later explain. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." As recounted in Eric Larson's book The Devil in the White City, H. Holmes began his 2-year-long murder spree at a moment in history where an unprecedented throng of unknown, unaccompanied strangers were flooding the streets of Chicago looking for temporary housing. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair was one of American history's most attended cultural events, with millions of people attending over duration of the fair. Noting the thousands of people who went missing during the World's Fair, some papers suggested the actual count of Holmes' victims stretched into the 200s. For the most part, Holmes represented himself at his trial, displaying his classic grace and a remarkable familiarity with the law, according to one paper of the time. His charm wasn't enough for the jurors, though, and he was unanimously sentenced to hanging. Very familiar with what could be done to a body after death, Holmes requested that his be encased in cement within his coffin. Before his death in 1896, H. Holmes had suggested that he was turning into the devil. Even his face, he said, was taking on a demonic look. Indeed, when the floor was dropped beneath him, his neck didn't snap like it was supposed to. He lay twitching for 20 minutes before being pronounced dead. Later, strange fates befell the people connected to the case. The man who had initially tipped off the police to H. Holmes' illegal dealings was shot by a Chicago police officer. The warden at the prison where Holmes had been held killed himself. The office of the district attorney, who argued the famous case, caught on fire. The only item to survive the blaze intact was a photo of Holmes. Patrick Quinlan, the former caretaker of the castle who, after Holmes, knew the most about the haunted building, committed suicide in 1914. He left a one-sentence note. "I could not sleep."
Number 4.
Most people are familiar with the basic plot of Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Few people realize, however, that there was a real-life Dr. Hyde who also mixed dangerous chemicals and changed from being a well-respected member of society into a notorious villain. In 1905, Dr. Bennett Clark Hyde, a prominent doctor in Kansas City, Mo., eloped with Frances Swope, a niece of local millionaire Colonel Thomas Swope. The Swope family was strongly opposed to the marriage, believing that Hyde only wanted to marry into money. Frances's father, Logan Swope, had died in 1900, leaving a widow and 7 children behind. Colonel Swope had no children of his own, so he moved into the Logan Swope residence in Independence, Mo., and set aside money to be paid to the 7 children upon his death. His will also established another fund to be split among all surviving relatives equally, but he was thinking of giving the money to charity instead. These intentions were well known to all members of the family. On October 1, 1909, J. Moss Hunton, who was Swope's cousin and an executor of his estate, fell ill. Hyde and Dr. George T. Twyman, the family physician, were both called to check on him. Hyde suggested bleeding Hunton, a practice that used to be common in the medical profession but was by then falling out of favor. By the time Hyde finally stopped the process of drawing blood from his arm, Hunton died. The death was ruled accidental. Then on October 3, Swope, already bedridden from a fall the month before, took a pill that a nurse had received from Hyde. His condition deteriorated rapidly and severely, but Twyman was never called to look after his patient. Swope died that same day. If Hyde had stopped at this point, his actions might have gone undetected. Instead, he hatched a plan so reckless that it's a wonder he ever thought he would get away with it. In December of 1909, the Swope mansion was struck by an outbreak of typhoid fever. Hyde claimed that the water source from which they had all been drinking was contaminated. 9 different people, family members, servants and visitors, became ill. One of them, Chrisman Swope, died after taking some medicine provided by Hyde. Lucy Swope, who cut short a trip to Europe after learning of her brother's death, also fell ill within days of her return. She was not, however, staying at the Swope mansion and did not drink any water there. Hyde had insisted upon escorting her back to Missouri from New York, and on that trip he had given her water from a special bottle. If that were not incriminating enough, while he was away the sicknesses at the Swope mansion seemed to all but disappear. Outside medical examiners were called in, and soon the police were involved. The bodies of the family members who had died were exhumed and found to have been poisoned. Investigators discovered that he had purchased typhoid and other germs, as well as a variety of poisons. He claimed the germs were for experiments and the poison was to kill bugs in his office, but his clerk and janitor had never been warned about the use of such toxic substances there. On April 16, 1910, Hyde was put on trial for the murder of Colonel Swope. Evidence related to the other deaths and illnesses were presented at trial to show that he intended to kill most of the Swope family for their fortune. On May 16 of that same year he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But Mrs. Hyde had used her wealth to hire the best lawyers available, so the story doesn't end there. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court and overturned. The second trial had to be halted when one of the jurors suffered a mental breakdown. The third ended in a mistrial when the jurors couldn't agree on a verdict. At this point, prosecutors decided that there was no point to continuing on to a fourth trial for the same offense. Dr. Hyde was a free man. Things did not go as smoothly as he might have hoped, however. After giving birth to 2 children, Frances divorced him in 1920, accusing him of cruelty and violence. His medical career was damaged by his notoriety, and for a while he was forced to work as a simple laborer.
Number 5.
The Hatton Garden robbery captured the imagination of the public in 2015 when a gang of elderly men who became known as the Diamond Weezers made off with so much gold and jewelry they needed wheelie bins to carry it all. ITV's 4-part Hatton Garden, starring beloved veteran actor Timothy Spall, began yesterday and unravels the fascinating crime story. Spall plays career criminal Terry Perkins, one of the ringleaders of the sensational heist. Perkins, who died in 2018, was captured along with 6 other gang members in 2016. However, the mastermind who disabled the security system to let the gang into the Hatton Garden safe deposit building evaded capture for 3 years. The man, known only by his nickname Basil, was disguised in a ginger wig, Fassamiscan hat, and left no forensic trace at the scene. Police even offered a £20,000 reward in 2016 after admitting they had no idea who the mystery man was. After a global manhunt, police identified Michael Seed in November 2015 but waited until March 2018 to arrest him when they could capture him red-handed with more than 100,000 stolen items from the heist. The raid on his home in Islington found £143,000 worth of gold ingots, gems and jewelry in Seed's bedroom. He was believed to have been melting down gold and breaking up jewelry from the stash on his bedroom workbench. Seed was brought to justice in March 2019 after he was found guilty of conspiracy to burgle the Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Company. However, to secure a conviction, prosecutors needed to prove in court that the man they had on CCTV from the Hatton Garden raid was in fact Seed. The heavily disguised mystery figure was seen using a set of keys to let other gang members into the safe deposit building and helping to take black bin liners full of loot away from the scene. However, Seed claimed he could have been on a family holiday in Cornwall or visiting his elderly mother in Cambridge at the time of the burglary and said he had never been known as Basil. With only the movement of an anonymous figure to go on, the crucial identification rested on Seed's unusual manner of walking. Incredibly, that came when forensic gait expert Gordon Burrow likened Seed's walk to that of Charlie Chaplin. The chiropodist with a doctorate in forensic podiatry analysis told jurors the unusual limp offered strong support for the prosecution case that Seed was in fact the Basil figure. The prosecution established that Seed had posed as a BT engineer to tamper with the security system before the burglary, then used a 2G mobile phone jammer to block the alarm signal. He was one of the 2 men who climbed into the vault to loot 73 deposit boxes after the gang drilled through a thick concrete wall. Detectives believed that the gang could have been operating undetected for decades before they were caught for the Hatton Garden heist, however they could not link them as a whole to any other burglaries. However, Terry Perkins had already served 22 years for the 1983 Security Express robbery when 15 masked men armed with pistols and shotguns stole £6 million. Fellow gang member Brian Reeder meanwhile was involved in the Brinks Matt Gold heist, which took place near Heathrow in 1983, in which 3 tons of gold bullion was stolen. After Michael Seed's conviction, which led to a 10-year sentence, he said, "Everybody calls me Basil now. I'll be known as Basil for the rest of my life."
Number 6.
Greater Cleveland has been home to more than 10,000 homicides in the past 60 years. Many were in the news for weeks, a few for years. But only one grabbed the town's attention and kept it for nearly a half-century. Time has relaxed its grip on the most riveting murder mystery in the region's history. Most young people today neither know nor care about what happened in the early morning hours of July 4, 1954, in a second-story bedroom at 28,924 Lake Road in Bay Village. But until O.J. Simpson got away with the 1994 killing of his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and of Ronald Goldman, the murder of Marilyn Shepard may have been the 20th century's most widely covered whodunit. Syndicated columnist Dorothy Kilgallen, who covered the first trial for some of the nation's largest newspapers, wrote that the Shepard case ranked with the 1892 murder trial of alleged axe murderer Lizzie Borden. Following the daily trial dispatches, Ernest Hemingway wrote from Havana, "A trial like this, with its elements of doubt, is the greatest human story of all. This is the real thing. This trial has everything the public clamors for." Indeed, it had sex, suburbia, money, power, intrigue, mystery, a pregnant and pretty young victim. And it came at a time when 3 daily newspapers were engaged in ferocious competition for reader attention in a prosperous central city and its booming suburbs. Technically, the brutal murder of Marilyn Shepard remains unsolved. But from the moment patrolman Fred Drenkin was dispatched to the Shepard home at 5:57 a.m. that July 4 morning 60 years ago, until Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Bill Mason officially closed the books 48 years later, the identity of the primary suspect never once changed. Evidence and common sense always pointed to one man, the right man. And 3 times, twice in person and once in absentia, Dr. Sam Shepard was tried for the brutal murder of his wife. Shepard, the 30-year-old Bay Village osteopath whose family founded and controlled the local hospital, was convicted in 1954 and shipped off to prison for life. The trial lasted 8 weeks, with the most damning testimony coming from Shepard and his utterly implausible version of what happened that night, including the 2 encounters with the bushy-haired man he invented as Marilyn's killer. In 1966, the U.S. Supreme Court set aside the jury verdict, citing a climate of inherently prejudicial publicity and the trial judge's failure to control disruptive influences in the courtroom. Later that year, with F. Lee Bailey as his lawyer, Shepard was acquitted. He never took the stand. As a free man, Shepard became a professional wrestler, debuting as Killer Sam Shepard. He died of liver failure in 1970. On that night of the killing, 7-year-old Sam Reese Shepard slept in a nearby bedroom when his mother was bludgeoned 35 times in what had all the earmarks of a crime of passion. 45 years later, Sam Reese Shepard, ably represented by Cleveland lawyer Terry Gilbert, sought to clear his father's name by filing a wrongful imprisonment suit against the state. The rubber match was a mismatch. The trial took 10 weeks. A jury took all of 3 hours to unanimously conclude Sam Shepard had not been wrongfully imprisoned for murder. Assisted by Mason, Steve Deaver was lead trial lawyer for the county in the 3rd trial. During a career as prosecutor that spanned 25 years, Deaver prosecuted more than 100 murder trials, many of them high-profile. "But this is the case people always ask me about," said Deaver. "This case involved what was basically an instantaneous eruption of events. And there was an extreme amount of pain and cruelty caused by the perpetrator against Marilyn Shepard. That pain, Deaver believes, was inflicted by Sam Shepard. Had the wrongful imprisonment trial been a criminal case, it's pretty clear the jury would have found Shepard guilty." Nevertheless, Gilbert has never abandoned his minority view that his client's father didn't do it, insisting his case included solid forensic proof that Shepard could not have committed the insanely brutal beating of the wife he loved. But Cuyahoga County, even 60 years later, seems incapable of cleaning its dirty hands over how it ruined so many lives, including a young boy who still suffers from that fateful night in 1954, added Gilbert. Most of the prosecutors, police and journalists who covered or participated in the original investigation and trial are deceased. But enough are still around to establish a clear consensus. Drenkin, who later served 8 years as Bay Village police chief, gave testimony during the first trial that helped unravel Shepard's flimsy alibi. "I think something popped inside him that night," Drenkin, now 87, told me a few weeks ago. "I think he got so wrapped up in himself and his story that he talked himself into thinking he didn't do it." By 1954, Doris O'Donnell was already one of the brightest stars in Cleveland journalism. The Shepard case made her a superstar. O'Donnell knew the Shepard family. She was the first to interview Shepard's mistress. And she was the only journalist to cover all 3 trials. O'Donnell, 93, still has little tolerance for anyone who thinks Shepard might be innocent. "It was a murder of elimination," she said. "He wanted to get rid of his wife." Bill Tanner covered the first trial for the Cleveland Press and supervised coverage of the second. Tanner has little or no doubt about Shepard's guilt. And he challenges the widely accepted notion, suggested in the Supreme Court ruling, that the press crossed some journalistic fairness line in its coverage. Were it not for the press's legendary editor, Louis Seltzer, Tanner thinks Shepard would have gotten away with murder. "Only Louis could have challenged the establishment the way he did on that case," said Tanner, now 89. The Shepard family owned Bay Village. All that evidence would have been swept aside. In the days leading up to Shepard's arrest, a front-page headline in the press demanded to know who speaks for Marilyn. In the 60 years since, a great many have done just that.
Number 7.
On May 5, 1993, 3 young boys from West Memphis, Arkansas, left their homes for a bike ride. The next day their bodies were found in a secluded, wooded area known as Robin Hood Hills. Stevie, Branch, Christopher Byers and Michael Moore were second graders at Weaver Elementary School. The boys had been stripped naked, hogtied with their own shoelaces, viciously beaten and left in a muddy creek to die. After a month of investigating, Arkansas authorities made no arrests. Under mounting pressure from an outraged community, the focus turned to 3 local teens. They were known for wearing black and listening to heavy metal. Jason Baldwin, 16, Jesse Miskelly, 17, and Damian Etchells, 18, were ultimately convicted in 1994. Baldwin and Miskelly were sentenced to life in prison. Etchells, who had been tried as an adult, was sentenced to death. But questions about the investigation and the convictions began immediately. Etchells, the suspected ringleader, had a history of psychiatric problems and violent outbursts, which was apparently the only reason investigators targeted him. In this Bible Belt community there was speculation that the killers may have been part of a satanic cult, and Etchells had expressed interest in the occult and in the pagan nature religion called Wicca, sometimes associated with witchcraft. All of the evidence against the young men was circumstantial. No DNA from the suspects was found at the crime scene or on the children. But police finally got a confession from Miss Skelly. Miss Skelly's attorney said his client was mentally slow and had been manipulated into confessing, simply telling investigators what they wanted to hear. A local woman who claimed she heard Etchells bragging about the murders later recanted her story. The case began to attract interest far beyond Arkansas, and in 1996, HBO filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky released Paradise Lost: The Child Murders at Robin Hood Hills. The documentary was a major success and was followed by 2 more, Paradise Lost 2, Revelations, and Paradise Lost 3, Purgatory. Although many in West Memphis were quick to target the 3 outcasts as killers, many on the outside believed they had been convicted on false evidence and lies. With the release of the first Paradise Lost in 1996, the story grabbed the attention of the general population and caused a public outcry of justice for the 3 teens. There was widespread criticism of the manner in which the criminal investigation was handled. There were multiple errors at the crime scene alone. The bodies had been removed from before the coroner arrived to determine the state of rigor mortis. The coroner wasn't brought in until 2 hours after the bodies were discovered, which meant they had been exposed to sunlight and insects. Furthermore, Miss Skelly's former attorney Dan Stidham called the coroner's investigation extremely substandard. Some physical evidence was stored in paper sacks obtained from a supermarket instead of containers with known origin. During the production of the first Paradise Lost feature, John Mark Byers, adoptive father of victim Christopher Byers, gave a knife to cameraman Doug Cooper, who handed it to the documentary crew. Documentary filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky returned to New York only to discover that the knife had blood on it. They sent it to the West Memphis Police Department, and the knife underwent DNA analysis, which determined that the DNA matched Chris and John's blood type. Questions arose about how the knife could have contained 2 of the victims' blood and whether the finding introduced reasonable doubt as to the convicted trio's guilt. In Paradise Lost 2, a forensic scientist, Brent Turvey, concluded that human bite marks could have been left on one of the victims. The potential bite marks were noticed in photographs years after the trials and were not inspected until years after the murders. The state eventually determined that there were no bite marks, yet further examination resolved that if the marks were in fact bite marks, they didn't match any of the convicted men's teeth. Celebrities including Johnny Depp, Eddie Vedder and the Dixie Chicks joined the cause to free the men, now called the West Memphis 3, WM3. Amy Berg made a documentary on the case titled West of Memphis. In 2007, the case was reopened after the discovery of new forensic evidence. There was a new statute that permitted post-conviction testing of DNA evidence, which led Etchells to file a petition. Etchells' lawyer stated that the new DNA evidence proved his client was not at the scene. Other DNA from the crime scene was tested, and none matched Etchells, Baldwin, or Miss Skelly. A hair was found tied into the knots used to bind one of the victims, and it was deemed not inconsistent with Steve Branch's stepfather, Terry Hobbs.